Wife Eleanor died on a Tuesday morning in October. A semi-truck jumped the median on Route 7 outside Bennington, and that was that. 34 years of marriage, and a state trooper standing on my porch at 9:47 in the morning telling me my whole life was over before I'd finished my second cup of coffee. I'm 63 years old. I taught high school history in Vermont for 31 years before I retired last spring. Eleanor was a pediatric nurse at Southwestern Vermont Medical Center, and everybody who ever met her loved her. That's not a husband talking, that's just a fact. The line at her wake stretched out the funeral home door and down the sidewalk in the freezing November rain. Kids she'd taken care of 20 years ago showed up with their own children. Her sister flew in from Phoenix. Old neighbors, her colleagues. The whole town, it felt like. I held it together through the service. I held it together through the burial. I even held it together when my daughter Rachel and her husband packed up to drive back to Burlington the next morning, and Rachel hugged me at the door and whispered, "Daddy, you have to eat. Promise me you'll eat." I held it together until exactly 11 days after the funeral, when our family attorney Frank Petrovich called and asked if I could come down to his office in Manchester. Said there were some things from Eleanor's estate we needed to go over. Routine stuff, he said, but better in person. I drove down the next morning in a kind of fog. I remember thinking the maples along the road looked obscene that year. All that screaming red and orange. Like the world hadn't gotten the memo that something was supposed to be different now. Frank's been our family lawyer since 1994. Did our wills, our house closing, helped Rachel set up her business. He's a decent man, careful, the kind who clears his throat before he says anything serious. So when I sat down across from him and he cleared his throat 3 times before he could get a word out, I knew. "Tom," he said, "there's an asset in Eleanor's estate that I don't believe you were aware of." I just looked at him. He slid a manila folder across the desk. Inside was a deed, a property deed for a unit in a condominium building in Saratoga Springs, New York. 2-bedroom, 12th floor, overlooking Congress Park. Purchased in cash in 2003. Title held in Eleanor's maiden name. Property taxes paid every year out of an account I'd never seen on any joint statement. I read it twice. I read it 3 times. The numbers weren't making sense to me. 2003. That was the year Rachel started kindergarten. The year we redid the kitchen. The year Eleanor's mother died and we drove down to Connecticut every other weekend for 6 months to help her father pack up the house. There must be a mistake, I said. I remember my voice sounded very far away. Eleanor didn't have any money in 2003. We barely had any money in 2003. Frank wouldn't meet my eyes. I've verified it, Tom. It's hers. It was hers. It's yours. Yours now. The will was very specific. It transfers to you in fee simple. How much is it worth? I had it appraised last week. $640,000. I sat there in his office for I don't know how long. Frank offered me water, offered me coffee, offered to call Rachel. I just kept staring at this deed for a condominium in a town 2 hours away that my wife had apparently owned, in secret, for 23 years. Saratoga Springs. We'd been there exactly once together, for a wedding in 2011. Eleanor had said she didn't care for the town, said it felt fussy, said the racetrack crowd gave her a headache. Frank handed me an envelope before I left. Inside was a single key on a plain brass ring, and a slip of paper with an address and a unit number written in Eleanor's handwriting. Her round, careful, nurse's handwriting that I'd been reading my whole adult life on grocery lists and birthday cards and notes on the fridge. I drove home in that same fog. I didn't tell Rachel. I didn't tell anyone. For 3 days, I sat in our kitchen and looked at that key on the counter and tried to understand what kind of woman I'd been married to for 34 years. There are a lot of things you assume when you find out your dead wife had a secret apartment. I won't pretend I didn't go through every one of them. An affair, obviously. That was the first place my mind went, and it stayed there for about 36 hours. I lay awake the first 2 nights running through every business trip, every nursing conference, every weekend she'd gone down to visit her father after her mother passed. I felt sick. I felt like a fool. I felt like everything we built was a stage set somebody had painted over a hole in the ground. But then I'd think about Eleanor. Actual Eleanor, the woman who'd nursed me through prostate surgery in 2019 and slept in the recliner next to my hospital bed for 4 straight nights because she didn't trust the night staff. The woman who'd cried at every single one of Rachel's school plays, including the one in 2nd grade where Rachel was a tree and had no lines. And I'd think, no, that's not what this is. But I didn't know what it was. So on the 4th day, I got in my truck and I drove to Saratoga Springs. The building was nicer than I expected. Brick, pre-war, with a doorman who looked at me funny when I told him the unit number. I rode up alone in a brass elevator that smelled like lemon polish, and I stood outside that door for what felt like 10 minutes before I could make myself put the key in the lock. When the door swung open, I froze. There was a man sitting on the couch. He stood up when he saw me, tall, lanky, maybe 35 years old, dark hair going gray at the temples already, wearing a sweater that looked too big for him. His face was the color of old paper. We just stared at each other. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. My hand was still on the doorknob. "You're Tom," he finally said. His voice was quiet. "You must be Tom, Eleanor's husband." I nodded, I think. I don't actually remember. "I'm so sorry," he said. "I didn't know how else to do this. I've been here since Monday. I didn't know where else to go." I closed the door behind me. I didn't sit down. I couldn't sit down. I just stood there in the foyer of this strange, beautiful apartment that my wife had apparently been keeping for 23 years, looking at a man who knew my name. "Who are you?" He swallowed hard. I watched his throat work. "My name is Daniel Mercer. Eleanor was my mother. I want to tell you that I had some immediate response to that. I want to tell you that I yelled or wept or asked the right questions. But what I actually did was sit down on the floor. Right there in the foyer, in my coat, on the rug. I just sat down. My legs stopped working. He brought me a glass of water. He sat on the floor across from me, his back against the wall, and he waited. He had her eyes. I'd been trying to figure out what was familiar about him, and that was it. He had Eleanor's gray-green eyes, the same shape, the same way of looking at you like he was trying to read something just behind your face. "I'm 34, he said eventually. "I was born in May of 1991. She gave me up when I was 9 days old. Eleanor and I had been married for 2 years. We'd been trying to have a baby and it wasn't happening. Rachel didn't come until 1998, after 2 rounds of IVF and a miscarriage that nearly broke us. 1991. I tried to remember 1991. I remembered her going down to Connecticut to take care of her mother, who'd had her first heart episode that spring. I remembered Eleanor being gone for almost 3 months. I remembered being 28 years old and miserable and missing my wife. "She wasn't your wife yet," Daniel said softly, and I realized I must have said part of that out loud. "She was, but the baby, I wasn't yours. I'm not yours. She and my biological father, it happened before she met you. Before she ever met you. Before she ever met you." "That's not possible," I said. "We met in college. We were 20 years old." I know you were." He was crying now, very quietly, in a way that suggested he'd been doing it for days. "She told me everything in a letter. She left me a letter. It's on the kitchen table. You should read it. You should read it before I tell you anything else, because I might get it wrong." I made it to the kitchen on legs that didn't feel like mine. The letter was in a cream-colored envelope, the kind Eleanor always bought at the stationer's in Manchester. My name was on the front in her handwriting. I'll tell you what was in that letter, because there's no point keeping it private anymore. Eleanor and I had grown up 4 towns apart in Connecticut. We didn't meet until our junior year at UConn, but when she was 17 years old, the summer before her senior year of high school, Eleanor had been seeing a boy 2 years older than her. His name was Richard Halloran. He was the son of a doctor in their town, headed to Dartmouth in the fall. "Charming," she wrote, "in the way certain young men are charming, the way that makes you think you're the only person in the world." She got pregnant in July. She told him in August. He told her to take care of it. He told her his future was not going to be derailed by a stupid girl who couldn't be careful. He told her if she ever contacted him again, his father would make sure she lost her place at the state college she was scheduled to attend in the fall. She was 17 years old. She didn't tell her parents. She told her parents she'd gotten an early acceptance to a special pre-nursing program in Pennsylvania and would be moving down there for her senior year. She wrote them letters every week for 9 months. She lived in a Catholic home for unwed mothers in Scranton. She had the baby. She signed the papers. She came home and finished high school at a different school where nobody had known her before, and she told her parents she'd outgrown her old friends, and she went to college and met me when she was 20. She never told anybody, not her parents, not me, not her sister, not a single human being on this earth knew about Daniel Mercer until she sat down to write that letter, which she had updated, she said, every 5 years. The version I held in my hand was dated August of last year. She'd hired a private investigator in 1996 to find out what had happened to the baby. The investigator had found him. He'd been adopted by a couple in Albany, the Mercers. Father was an accountant, mother was a librarian. Good people, the investigator said, loved their boy. The Mercers had told Daniel he was adopted from the time he could understand the word. The condominium in Saratoga Springs had been purchased in 2003 because that was the year Daniel started college at Skidmore, which is in Saratoga. Eleanor had gone there. She had not approached him. She had sat in coffee shops and walked through Congress Park and gone to a few of his lacrosse games, sitting in the back of the bleachers, and she had watched her son from a distance for 4 years. The apartment had been her place to stay. After he graduated, she kept it because, by then, it had become her secret room. Her one space in the world that was only hers. She had been writing him letters for 34 years and never sending them. They were in a box under the bed in the second bedroom, Daniel told me later. 311 letters. He'd read maybe 40 of them since he arrived. In her letter to me, she said this. I'm going to paraphrase because the words themselves I want to keep. She said that she had carried this secret because she was ashamed, and because she was afraid, and because by the time she met me, she had decided that Eleanor with a baby and Eleanor with Tom couldn't be the same person, and she chose to be Eleanor with Tom. She said she had loved me from the second week she knew me. She said Rachel was the greatest gift of her life, and she had spent every day of Rachel's childhood trying to atone for the child she gave away. She said she was sorry. She said it many times. She said she was sorry and she was a coward and she should have told me, and she hoped I could forgive her. She said she had instructed Frank to contact Daniel if anything ever happened to her. She said she hoped that if I was reading this, I had not yet thrown the key into the woods. She said, please, please, please be kind to him. He didn't ask for any of this. The last line of the letter said, he's going to look like you to himself before he looks like me. Be patient with him, my love. I sat at that kitchen table for a long time. Daniel had gone into the living room. I could hear him crying very quietly out there, trying not to be heard. I could see through the doorway the kind of careful furniture Eleanor liked, a vase she'd inherited from her grandmother. A blue throw blanket I would have sworn was on her couch at home until I remembered she'd been knitting 2 of them that spring. 23 years. She'd had this room for 23 years. She had come up here on her nursing conferences, which I now understood were not real, 4 or 5 times a year, for a long weekend at a time. She had sat in this kitchen and made tea in a kettle that wasn't mine, and looked out at the park and thought about a son she could not have. I don't know how to explain what I felt. I was angry. I won't lie about that. I was angry at the lying, the years and years of lying. The way I had been a person she could not trust with the truth of herself. I was angry that she had died without telling me. I was angry that this young man in the next room was now my problem, and angry at myself for thinking of him that way for even a second. But underneath the anger, I felt something I did not expect, which was a strange, terrible tenderness for the 17-year-old girl who had gone alone to Pennsylvania in 1990 and sat by herself in a home for unwed mothers and held a baby for 9 days before she signed him over. I had known Eleanor for 43 years, and I had never known that girl. She had never let me meet her. And now she was gone, and the only thing left of that girl was a 34-year-old man crying on a couch in the next room. After a while, I got up and I went and sat next to him. He looked at me like he was waiting to be told to leave. "Tell me about your parents," I said. "The Mercers, your folks. Tell me about them." He stared at me. And then, slowly, he started talking. His father had died in 2018, pancreatic cancer. His mother was alive, but in memory care in Albany, didn't recognize him most days. He'd been an only child. He worked as a physical therapist at a hospital in Schenectady. He'd never married. He'd known he was adopted his whole life, and he said he'd never really thought about his biological parents until his mother got sick and started losing herself. And then he'd done one of those DNA tests, and the company had matched him with a maternal cousin in Connecticut, and he'd written that cousin a letter, and the cousin, who as far as I can tell is Eleanor's sister Patricia's daughter, had figured out who he must be. She'd called Eleanor. This was in February, 8 months before the accident. He said Eleanor had called him back the same day. They had spoken on the phone for 4 hours. She'd told him everything. She had not told me. Even then, she had told him she needed time to figure out how to tell me and the family, and that she wanted to do it right. They'd met for coffee in Saratoga 3 weeks later. He'd shown her pictures of himself growing up. She'd cried for most of 2 hours, he said, and then they'd had lunch. And then she'd hugged him for a long time and told him she would call him the next week. She had called him every week from March until October. They had met 4 more times in this apartment. She had told him about me, about Rachel, about her sister and her parents and her childhood. She had been planning to tell me at Christmas, he said. She had told him so the last time they'd spoken, 4 days before she died. I sat with that for a while. I thought about how she had been on the phone in our backyard a lot last summer, walking the perimeter of our lawn, the way she always did when she was talking to someone she cared about. I had assumed those calls were her sister, or her old nursing school friend Marlene. I had walked past the window and waved at her, and she had waved back, and I had not asked. I had also not asked about the conferences. Not once in 23 years. I had asked once, I think, somewhere around 2005, and she'd said something like, "Oh, you know, the same boring continuing ed stuff, you don't want to hear about it," and I had laughed and let it go, and somehow that had become a settled thing between us. Her trips were her trips. I gave her her space. I had been proud of myself for it. I had thought I was being a good husband. I'm telling you all of this because I don't want to pretend I was an innocent man in a story about a deceptive woman. I had let her have a closed door, and she had built a whole room behind it, and the fault for that is not all hers. I asked Daniel if he was hungry. He said he hadn't eaten in 2 days. I took him out to a diner on Broadway, and I bought him a cheeseburger and a milkshake, and I watched my dead wife's son eat in a way that reminded me of my daughter at 13, hunched over his plate like somebody might take it away from him. I asked him about the man. Richard Halloran. He told me he'd looked him up. Halloran had become a cardiothoracic surgeon in Boston. Married. 3 kids. Foundation board. The whole golden life. Eleanor had told Daniel in one of their phone calls that she had written Halloran a letter in 1998 telling him the child existed and was healthy, in case he ever wanted to know. Halloran had written back a 2-line response telling her to never contact him again or he would involve his attorney. I'm not going to lie. I sat in that diner and I thought some very ugly things about Richard Halloran. I thought about what it would feel like to drive to Boston and put my fist through his teeth. I'm 63 years old, and I have never punched another human being in my life, and I sat in that diner thinking about it. But Daniel said something then that stopped me. He said, I don't want anything from him. I never have. I don't want to know him. I don't want his name. I don't want his money. I don't want an apology. He's not my father. My father was an accountant from Albany who taught me how to throw a curveball and walked me down the aisle at my college graduation because I asked him to. He's my father. That's done. He said it without any drama. He said it the way you'd say the sky is blue. I drove him back to the condominium. We stood in the lobby for a minute, neither of us sure what to do. I'll be at the Hampton Inn, he said. I shouldn't be staying here. I'm sorry I shouldn't have been here when you came. I just didn't know. Stay, I said. It's your mother's place. Stay as long as you need to. He started crying again. I put my hand on his shoulder. It was a strange thing touching him. I had never touched him before. He felt solid and real, and he was a stranger, and he was also, somehow, my wife's son. I drove home that night. I called Rachel from a rest stop on the Northway, and I told her I needed to tell her something, and that I needed to do it in person, and could she come down for the weekend? She said yes without asking why. She's a good girl. She's always been a good girl. I told Rachel everything on Saturday morning at our kitchen table. I read her the letter. I showed her the picture of Daniel that Eleanor had kept tucked in the back of the deed folder, a picture from his college graduation that he'd given her in March. Rachel cried for an hour. Then she got up and made us both grilled cheese sandwiches the way her mother used to, with mayonnaise on the outside of the bread instead of butter, and she said, "Dad, I have a brother." She said it like a fact she was trying out. "You have a half-brother." She said it like a fact she was trying out. "You have a half-brother." Same thing, she said, and she meant it. We drove to Saratoga together 2 weeks later. I had told Daniel we were coming. He'd been staying at the condominium. He had not, he told me later, been able to bring himself to leave. He had been sleeping on the couch because he could not bring himself to sleep in his mother's bed. Rachel met him in the lobby. She walked right up to him, and she looked at him for a long second, and then she put her arms around him, and she said, "Hi, I'm Rachel. I'm so glad you're real. I'm 63 years old, and I have seen a lot of things in my life, and I have never seen anything more beautiful than my daughter hugging that man in the lobby of that building. We spent the weekend together, the three of us." Rachel asked him every question I hadn't thought to ask, about his adoptive parents, about his childhood, about his work, about whether he'd ever been to Vermont, about what he liked to eat for breakfast. They talked about their mother. They compared notes on her laugh, on the way she said certain words, on her stubborn refusal to ever eat shellfish for reasons she would never explain. They both cried, and then they both laughed about crying, and I sat at the kitchen table and watched my dead wife's 2 children meet each other, and I thought, Eleanor, you should have lived to see this. You stupid, brave, frightened, beautiful woman. You should have lived to see this. That was 8 months ago. I am writing this from the kitchen of the house I shared with my wife for 34 years. Daniel is upstairs in the guest room. He came up for the weekend. He comes up about once a month now. He calls me on Sundays. He has, in the slow, careful way of a man who already had a father and is not looking to replace one, started calling me Tom in a tone that means something more than my name. Rachel is in Burlington, but she drives down most weekends now too, which she did not used to do because she likes being in the same room as her brother. They are putting together a quilt of who their mother was, the 2 of them, and they are letting me help, which I did not expect and have not earned. The condominium in Saratoga has been transferred into Daniel's name. I went back to Frank and we did the paperwork. Daniel did not ask for it. He tried, in fact, to refuse it. I told him his mother bought it because of him and kept it because of him, and the math of the thing was not complicated. He cried in Frank's office. Frank pretended very politely not to notice. I sold our cabin up on Lake Bomazine last spring. Eleanor and I had bought it in 1999 and we had loved it, and I could not bear to go back to it. I split the money 3 ways. Rachel and Daniel each got a third. I kept a third for myself. Rachel said, "Dad, you didn't have to." Daniel said, "Tom, this isn't right." I said, "It's exactly right. Your mother would have wanted it this way. And here is the part I want to tell you most, and I'm not sure I have the words for it, but I'm going to try. I forgave her. I don't mean I decided to. I mean it happened to me. I woke up one morning in February, 4 months after the funeral, and I made coffee, and I sat at the kitchen table, and I looked out at the snow in the yard, and I realized that I had stopped being angry. I had stopped feeling like a fool. I had stopped wanting to know why she had not trusted me. I understood, finally, that she had not failed to trust me. She had failed to trust herself. She had decided when she was 17 years old that she was a person who had to keep a secret in order to be loved. And she had carried that decision for 46 years, and the fact that she had been about to lay it down at last in our living room at Christmas with the tree lit up behind her, that was the thing that broke me. Not the secret. The almost telling, I miss her every day. I miss her with my coffee. I miss her in the car. I miss her at the grocery store, where I still buy 2 of everything by accident. I miss her when Daniel laughs at something Rachel says, because his laugh is exactly her laugh, and I never noticed the resemblance until he was sitting at our kitchen table. But here is what I want to say to anyone who has ever found a key to a door they didn't know existed and stood outside that door and been afraid to open it. Open it. What is on the other side might not be what you fear. It might be a person who has been waiting his whole life to be claimed by someone and didn't know how. It might be a piece of your wife's life you can finally hold in your hands. It might be your daughter sitting across the kitchen table from a brother she didn't know she had, asking him if he likes pancakes the same crooked way their mother used to, and laughing when he says yes. I lost my wife on a Tuesday morning in October. I thought that was the end of my family. It turned out it was only half the story. I am 63 years old. I have a son now. I did not give birth to him, and I did not raise him, and I will never, in the time I have left, be his father in the way. The man in Albany was his father. But I am going to be something to him, and he is going to be something to me. And Rachel is going to have a brother for the rest of her life. And somewhere, I have to believe, my Eleanor knows. She knows. She has to know. That's the only part of this story I am not willing to give up. I've been sitting with this story for a long time now, longer than the month since Eleanor died, because part of what I lost on that Tuesday in October was the version of my life where I thought I understood everything. And I want to tell you what I learned from being wrong about that. The truth is, Eleanor's secret didn't begin in 1990 when she went to that home in Pennsylvania. It began the moment a 17-year-old girl decided that the only way to be loved was to hide one half of herself. Every choice she made after that, the silence with her parents, the silence with me, the apartment in Saratoga, the 311 letters she never sent, every one of those was the same first decision repeating itself. That's how it works, I think. We make a choice when we're young and frightened, and then we spend 40 years building a life around it, and we call that life our character. But it isn't. It's just the shape the fear took. I should have asked. That's the part I have to own. For 23 years, my wife told me her trips were boring and I let her go. And I told myself I was being respectful, and what I was actually being was comfortable. There's a kind of love that asks the hard questions, and there's a kind of love that doesn't, and I am not going to pretend anymore that the second one is the more generous version. It isn't. It's the easier one. And the easier one cost Eleanor the chance to tell me the truth while she was still here, to be forgiven for it in person. If you take anything from what I've told you, I'd want it to be this. Be braver than I was. Ask the question you've been politely not asking. And if you are the one carrying something, the way Eleanor carried Daniel, put it down before the road takes the choice away from you. There is no shame so big that the people who love you can't sit with it. The shame is almost always smaller than the silence. I have a son now, at 63, who is not mine and is somehow mine anyway. I have a daughter who has a brother. I have a kitchen table where, on Sundays, 3 people sit who are still figuring out what to call each other, and we are figuring it out, slowly, with a lot of coffee and a lot of crying and a lot of laughing, too. Eleanor doesn't get to see it. That's the price of what she chose, and it's a real price, and I am not going to pretend otherwise. But the door opened anyway. And on the other side of it was more family, not less. That is the thing I did not expect, and the thing I want you to remember if you are ever standing outside a door of your own, afraid of what's inside. Open it. Open it, and stay long enough to see who is waiting.